Okay, let's shift to India now. India's been in the news, as you know, recently, and I want to get your thoughts on recent events in India with respect to the event related to the brutalization of this woman and the demonstrations that followed, and then the debates that ensued. And some say that these protests are about, deeper issues of patriarchy within India. And Fareed Zakaria of CNN has called it the beginning of an Indian Spring. How do you read these events?
The kind of violence that emerges as a result of this, simmering anger and frustration that you've been promised so much. This is sort of bonanza of globalization, of economic growth, a television set, a roof above your head, a scooter or maybe a car, and you're nowhere close to it after many, many years of, struggling in menial jobs. That, I think, is one of the reasons why we see such an upsurge of violence against the most vulnerable members of human communities in these places, which is women. I think patriarchy has a huge role to play on this. Traditional forms of misogyny, all of that has been in play for some time now, and they get distorted by when they come into contact with a certain kind of consumer modernity, which is completely valueless, which just believes in acquisition, through whatever means. And that is also a culture which is very widespread in India today. So I think rather than isolate this case as an instance of patriarchal oppression or oppression of a particular gender, I think we have to see it in a larger socio-economic context.
If one had to sort of press you a bit further on this issue and ask for sort of specific policy recommendations that can be pursued in India today that can make India a better place, not only for women, but for, the country as a whole, what would you say?
If you're, tracing this problem back to its roots, there is actually very little you can do. And that is why so many of us find ourselves helpless. Because there is no one or even 5 different policies at this point that can deal with this problem, which is of greater violence, greater conflict, deepening inequality, deepening anger and frustration.
Okay, let's shift now a bit to the Middle East and look at sort of U.S. policy there. What's your general sort of thesis and understanding of the shift in power relations that is allegedly taking place from the West toward the East?
There's such a deep-rooted, such an entrenched suspicion of American motives and actions in these places, dating back to the early years of this century in some instances, that I think it's best for the United States not to enter that realm in any kind of significant way and not to be seen to be, pushing people around because that just creates yet another volatile invariable in this already very tense and volatile situation.
On that point, though, how do you deal with these very difficult sort of moral questions when you have massive violence taking place, as we're seeing in Syria today, and really a sense that if there is no change in the status quo, the killing and the violence is going to just, continue?
When you have such a, tormented history in play, which is the case in large parts of the Middle East, then you have to be really careful about how you proceed in those areas. I mean, there have always been segments of the population in all these countries, including even in, let's not forget, even in Iraq or Afghanistan. A lot of people in Kabul were very much wanting the Americans to intervene and were very happy to see them when they drove into Kabul after driving out the Taliban. But that, I don't think that really amounts to a solid case for humanitarian intervention. You have to look at so many different factors when you do that.
What sort of strikes you as being the most important sort of lessons that we should be taking away from this particular very sort of sad period of history as we approach the 10th anniversary of the American invasion of Iraq?
I think there's several lessons. I mean, I think the most important and probably the most unexpected one for a lot of people in Europe and America was the lingering power of nationalism. The fact that Americans were welcomed by a lot of people in Iraq who were happy to get rid of Saddam Hussein, At the same time, they did not like the chaos and mayhem that resulted from the invasion. And they certainly did not like this heavy-handed American occupation and the fact that so quickly a large part of the population turned against the United States there just shows how deeply rooted some of these older traditions of anti-Western nationalism go. The other thing, I think, what that whole intervention showed was that the whole project of ideologically remaking these countries over in the image of the West, that has basically finished. That can no longer be revived, that is militarily unsustainable, impossible, financially completely unfeasible. And so that is one route that we should never go down. And it was a strange episode. I mean, this is the kind of thing that the communists were constantly being accused of using violence as a means of political change. And this is exactly what the United States and Britain were trying to do in Iraq, is to use war as a means to impose democracy.
Right. You recently wrote in one of your essays that the idea of the nation state, realized after such horrific bloodshed in Europe itself, was always a poor fit for Asia's diverse mosaic. Could you explain this?
Well, this is one of the unfortunate things that happened during the whole process of decolonization, that so many Asian countries, so many Asian leaders and intellectuals ended up adopting this very disastrous political model, which is that of the nation state, which in Europe itself, let's not forget, was imposed with great violence upon Europe's own patchwork of nationalities, ethnic, religious communities, and involved some horrific violence. The sort of 19th century, and especially the early part of the 20th century, it's an eloquent witness to that kind of violence. And we seem to be, going through that phase in different parts of Asia, where so much of our national energies in places like India or Pakistan go into holding on to bits and pieces of territories, suppressing this or that ethnic religious minority. You look at any country, look at Thailand, you look at Sri Lanka, you look at Indonesia, you look at the Philippines, the kind of investments that have been made into simply holding on to land, into sometimes completely useless, fallow, uncultivable land. Right. And I think that's been a real tragedy. That's kind of held back so many of these countries from just creating proper economic opportunities for their populations. For instance, the kind of investments that have been made in the military, with the result that the military becomes the strongest institution in the country, and you have decades and decades of military rule in places like Indonesia or in Pakistan, for that matter. So it's been a real tragedy. One that is not talked about often enough, but the fact is our multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies really required a different kind of political model. We needed, somewhat more relaxed, more flexible ideas of sovereignty, not this notion that you only belong to one nation state, you can only have allegiance to one flag, one particular national identity, because we all had, parallel overlapping identities. Back in the 19th century, living in these very large multinational empires, it was a very different situation altogether for all these peoples.
Right. But how do you respond to the sort of criticism of that perspective, that that's sort of unrealistic? If you're not a member of a nation state, you don't have a seat at the UN General Assembly, you don't have a passport to travel with. I mean, in other words, the question really is, what are the realistic alternatives for creating some sort of alternative to the European nation state?
The European Union is actually a very interesting model for countries like those in South Asia, which have long had very extensive trade links. People have been traveling across borders, and Pakistan was a great destination, great stopover, on the way to the Silk Route. All these trade links could be revived, could be revitalized. There's a whole sort of problem between India and Pakistan, which have led these two countries into several wars and some obscene amounts of expenditure on defense. We could have all avoided that if we had stuck to a larger notion of a South Asian federation.